Hello. We're going to be reviewing the Kirka conference grants and how you would write a proposal for these grants fall 2020 cycle. Just want to bring to everyone's attention that for this year, because of the pandemic, we're only covering the expenses for the virtual conferences. We're not actually covering any actual travel expenses this year. So my name's Dr. Mook, and even though the name says Jennifer Rose, that's my married name, but Jennifer Mook, and I'll be presenting on Kirka's behalf. So let me go ahead and pull that screen up for you so we can start the presentation. All right, how does it look, Mac? Does it look okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to review the process of producing an application for these Kirka conference grants, formerly known as our travel grants. This is again for the fall 2020 cycle. If you are planning on presenting at a conference in the spring of 2021, there will be another round of travel funding, probably being announced in January. So please watch for that if you're traveling in the spring or presenting in the spring. So the first and foremost question is, where can you find this information for the applications? And if you are on the UNG homepage, you can type in Kirka to the search, and you should easily be able to find the Kirka website, which Kirka stands for the Center for Undergraduate Research and Creative Activities. To find the information on the travel or conference grants, as well as other funding opportunities, as you can see over on the left-hand side bar, I have a gold arrow there pointing to the Student Opportunities tab. When you scroll over that, then the options will pop up, and one of which is the conference travel grants, which I have in the red square there. So that's what you would want to select in order to apply for one of these conference grants. When you click on that, it'll take you to the page for the conference grants, and we'll cover more of this, but the grants cover up to $500 of the fee for the registration for online-only conferences this year. All right, so this gives some basic information. We'll be covering some more of that. Remember that spring conferences, you would apply in the spring. So when you get to this page, when you're ready, you would click on the blue tab at the bottom that says Apply for a Grant, and you'll be ready to go. Please note that you have until Friday, September 18th at 3 p.m. to apply for these grants. At the bottom of the page, there are frequently asked questions, so I figured that would be a good place to start, just to kind of cover some of the basics. One is, can I apply for a conference grant if I already graduated? The name of the institution is the Center for Undergraduate Research. So these are grants that are meant for undergraduates only. If you are a graduate student looking for funding, there is a separate pool of money for graduate students. Please email Kirka or myself directly, and we'll get you to the appropriate person. Do I receive $500 if I win? Not necessarily. We will fund up to $500, so you can win $500, but it will go up to $500. So if your registration is only $100, we're not going to give you $500 for a $100 registration. Funds are typically reimbursed for allowable costs. And so make sure that you're not spending money that you shouldn't be. There are only certain things that Kirka can cover. And again, that will only be up to $500. Should I estimate on the lower end of my costs? No. What we want you to do is try to accurately estimate the amounts that you plan on spending. Now, this was more important when we actually had travel and you had to worry about airfare or car expenses and those kinds of things. So this year should be much more straightforward when we're just dealing with registration costs, but estimate the best that you can. If it's a conference that's a few months out and they haven't necessarily released the exact numbers yet, you can look at last year's registration costs as an estimate and try to give us the best estimate that you can. Will requesting above $500 disqualify me or hurt your chances? No. Like I said, we will fund up to $500. So just recognize that if the registration fee is higher than $500, you might have to come up with the rest of that money on your own. We'll cover content that needs to go into your cover letter, but one of the options or one of the items that you need to fill in is whether your conference is a local, state, regional, or national conference. And so one question we often get from students is, how do I know? Usually the website makes it fairly obvious as to the level. For instance, we have the Georgia Academy of Science. Well, that covers the whole state, so that's a state conference. There's a Southeastern Biologists meeting. So that would be more of a regional because it's the whole Southeast. It's bigger than a state. But if you cannot clearly delineate what kind of conference it might be or event, if you're in the arts, then talk to your faculty advisor to get a feel for what kind of conference it is, or you can email the conference or event organizers and kind of ask them how they would categorize the event that you're planning on going to. And what if I haven't been accepted yet to my conference? And that happens regularly, so don't freak out over that. It's okay if you haven't yet been accepted. You can submit a statement with the expected acceptance dates of the applications if the organization has posted that, or again, you can email the organizers and ask when you might find out for sure whether or not you've been accepted. Can I submit more than one application for conference grants? Yes, if you're going to multiple conferences, you can submit more than one application for the different conferences. Just make sure that you are clearly explaining in your cover letter why the conference you are currently planning on going to is important. Hopefully there's some differences between the conferences, but we will do the best we can to fund applicants as much as possible. All right, so those are the frequently asked questions. If you feel like you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the chat area and we will try to address those questions as they come in or at the end. So the items required for submission, and this is described in the info-ready components when you get to submit your application. And the big component is your cover letter. The cover letter is supposed to be 2 pages max, and please use your standard font sizes and margins when you're writing the letters. The information that needs to go into this cover letter is indicated here. Number 1, you need to provide the conference details. What's the name of the conference? Where is it at? When's it taking place? The type of conference, if it's the regional, state, national, etc. Okay? And remember, you're writing this to reviewers from a variety of majors. So be conscious of how you're writing these letters, that it is meant for a general audience, and you need to provide as much information as you can. Number 2, provide information on the review process if there is any. If there isn't any, then please state that and explain what you needed to do to apply. If you are working with other collaborators, please describe everyone involved directly with the research project, indicate who your faculty advisor or mentor might be, if you have fellow students that are collaborating or other faculty members that are collaborating. Indicate your role in the activity as you do that. All right, so sometimes we have a whole ensemble in music that go to events together. So explain your role in that activity. Provide your budget overview. And remember, for this year, we're only doing registration costs for the virtual conferences. There's no actual travel. So your budget overview should be pretty straightforward for this cycle. But please indicate all expenses that you might have related to attending that conference. All right, and lastly, and probably most importantly, is really explaining how the conference helps further your professional goals. Maybe this should be probably at least a paragraph of explaining why it's important for you to go to these events, what you think you will learn by going, how it will really benefit you in the long term, because that's really what Kirko wants to do, is really support students in taking that next step in their career. And so make that connection for the reader. Be really obvious what you think you'll get out of it. Right? For those of you that are working or performing with a group, if there's a whole group that's going, remember that each student must apply individually. There is not a group application. And so you might, especially for those in that have concrete research where they had to submit an abstract, that's one of the things you'll have to submit. We'll cover that in a second, but you're obviously going to need to submit the same abstract. However, your cover letter should be your own writing. They should not be carbon copies of each other. They should have the same information, but obviously how two people would write that letter and convey that information would be vastly different. And so your cover letters have to be your own work. If there are two students or two performers that really have equal responsibility in the presentation, again, you need to have separate applications, but then in your cover letter, really explain why you both need to go to this event, and instead of just the main author. Okay, you want to really clearly explain why it's important that both individuals or the whole group go together. We cannot promise that whole teams will be funded together. Some of that comes down to the individual writing, in addition to how many funds we have to support different students. Okay, but at least in the application, everybody needs to have their own application. All right. So as you put this cover letter together, there is a rubric that we use for judging. If you don't know what a rubric is, it's just kind of a checkoff box that we look for certain criteria. And then within that criteria, there's different levels. So it's kind of like grading, okay? And I'll show you the rubric here in a second. All right, so this is the rubric for this fall. And notice there's some flexibility for the scorers when they're looking at each of the criteria. But you have the impact of the presentation that has to do with the type of venue that you'll be presenting at, whether it's that local, state, regional, or national venue. Obviously, going to an international venue is the highest that you can attend, and that would have the biggest impact with respect to presenting on behalf of UNG. Student participation, and this is where we kind of evaluate your role in the project or performance. So again, clearly describe what your role is in the research or the presentation that you're submitting for. The type of conference, this was something not listed on the previous page. Different types of conferences or presentations for some of these artistic things. We look at who else is presenting. Is it a conference or event solely for undergraduates versus is it an event that is going to have professionals presenting and you're presenting alongside them? Again, this comes down to how much impact you're going to have on that community with respect to UNG. And then the academic and professional development area. This is that part that I said you really need to spend at least a paragraph talking about within your cover letter. that you are really writing about how this event is going to benefit you. You want your writing to be very clear and coherent. Throughout the whole cover letter, you want to make sure that it is grammatically clean, that there's no spelling errors. And so write it, read over it 5 times, hand it to somebody else, let them read it over to try to make sure that your writing is appropriate and that you've covered all the details that are expected. And notice over there on the bottom right in the score column, there's a ×2 section on there. So that's what I was saying. This is probably the most important section because it's going to count twice as much towards your total score compared to the other areas of the rubric. Okay, so really put some thought into why you're going, what you will get out of going, and make sure you put that effort into the writing. Right, so in addition to the cover letter, the other items that you need that were kind of mentioned is the original submitted abstract. Now that's really more for the research type presentations. If you have a creative work that you submit, such as a piece of art or a music piece, then you would submit a letter kind of explaining that submission, possibly even attach that, that piece in lieu of an abstract to your application. And then that proof of acceptance, either if you already have it or when you think you might get it, make sure that you have a statement of when you might expect that response. If you have any questions regarding any of these 3 things, the cover letter, submitting the abstract or creative work, or your proof of acceptance, please note the email address down here in blue, perkirka@ung.edu, and we can try to address your questions through an email as well. Okay, so in review, please access that InfoReady site via the Kirka website that we described at the beginning. Have ready to go your cover letter, your submitted abstract or artistic submission or a letter describing it, and then your proof of acceptance or a letter indicating that. Okay, and again, any questions to Kirka. So we appreciate you attending or watching this video on applying for conference grants, and we look forward to seeing your applications.
I have a question before we
Yes,
go.
ma'am.
I know we were talking about earlier how you asked me if I'd gotten like a conference grant or anything like that. What happens when like a conference gets canceled? Is the grant that you received, it's just like null and void? Like, will you no longer receive it? Will you just be able to say that you have it on file? Or let's say like you want to go to another conference, do you have to apply again for that grant?
Yes, that would have been just for that cycle. So number one, you still can put on your resume or your CV that you received a travel grant, which is really important to show that you've gone through that selection process and you were awarded one. Yeah, Kirka won't provide the money for an event that does not happen. So Kirka would retain that money, and I'm not sure exactly of the financial process. I would hope or assume that it's rolled into the following year, where they would then go through a process again. So a future event that you want to attend, you'd have to go through the same process again and get awarded, hopefully, a second time.
Alrighty. That was my only question, and I guess like it could be useful for whoever like, you know, watches this workshop or, you know, this presentation and is like, well, I got accepted into something last semester. What's gonna happen, you know?
Yeah, it's not an automatic rollover to the next time, as far as I know. You'd have to reapply again and hopefully get awarded a second time. So, you know, that said, when you're putting this on your resume or your CV, There's some resources out there that show you how to properly reference a conference that had been canceled. It obviously affected a lot of people this spring, both undergraduates and professionals. But still, the fact that you were accepted to go to the conference, that you were, received a travel grant, those are still very important professional development items.
Thank you.
Did anyone else submit any questions for us? Okay, well then I guess we will sign off, and we appreciate all of you attending.